we each hold different kinds of knowledge and wisdom. And I think for a very long time, we've prioritized academic credentials. And in co-creation, there's a lot of different kinds of wisdom that you want to bring to the table. And there's a lot of wisdom that I don't have. There's certain lived experiences that I don't have. And that is valuable. Just like understanding, having a PhD in a certain area is valuable.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season includes 25 incredible episodes devoted to the inner development goals. Based on the science of personal transformation, the IDG framework represents 23 skills needed for today's world. And of course, empathy is one of them. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Alia Whitney-Johnson, a social entrepreneur dedicated to co-creating solutions with young people who have experienced trauma, sexual abuse, and exploitation. At the ripe young age of 19, she founded Emerge, Sri Lanka's first and only nonprofit organization that supports teenage survivors of sexual abuse, helping them to heal, build self-sufficiency, and become leaders of change. Alia later founded Freedom Forward in San Francisco, working alongside youth, service providers, and government to prevent youth exploitation. With experience at McKinsey & Company and leadership roles on global boards, including MIT's Board of Trustees, Alia blends strategic expertise with a deeply human-centered approach to social change. She's a Rhodes Scholar with degrees from MIT and Oxford and brings her intellect and her heart to her work. Now back at Emerge, Alia is partnering with survivors to transform the very systems that have harmed them. Her approach is rooted in deep listening, collaboration, and the belief that survivor-led change is the key to breaking cycles of violence and injustice. I've invited Alia to join this special IDG series because she is highly skilled at co-creation, one of the 23 skills of the Inner Development Goals framework. Welcome to the show, Alia.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here, and it's so nice to see you again.
Alia, I always love asking my guests at the front end of this conversation because we've just read your bio. It's amazing work that you've done. It's incredible work that you've done, actually. But I wonder if there's anything that you want to share with listeners or viewers that might color in some more nuance to who you are besides that beautiful bio, and would sort of explain why you care so deeply about the work that you do, or anything else you want to share.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question because I think bios can be a little bit stuffy, and we never end up where we expect to end up, or at least I haven't. Growing up, I was very, very much a science and math nerd. I liked everything to have a clear answer, and I wanted to be able to logically work through everything. And so I ended up at MIT to study engineering, to be a problem solver, on a path to have technology change the world. And my worldview, I would say, really changed when I first went to Sri Lanka. I was fortunate when I was 19 to go as a volunteer during the summer to Sri Lanka on a tsunami relief trip. This was right after the 2004 tsunami that hit right after Christmas. And while I was there, I met this 11-year-old girl who had a 6-month-old son from her father. I was completely unequipped for this reality. I was there to do solar lighting systems and water filtration systems and on this mission to use technology to transform the world. And then I was faced with this very human problem. And as a result of her abuse, this girl was brave enough to actually go to the police and turn her father in and go to court. And this ended up taking 7 years, her court case. And ultimately, it was inconclusive. And to protect her during this incredibly long court case, she was locked away in a shelter to protect her from her father. And that's where I met her. And for me, this was a really foundational moment because I realized there was no engineering formula, there was no logical pathway to put her life back together. And I had all these rigorous tools, and I was a really good hard worker, and I was an A student. And yet I was faced with this very human situation, and my heart felt totally broken. And I had no knowledge or no tools to address what was in front of me. Um, and that was the beginning of Emerge, was like me trying to figure that out. It was very human. It was like me wanting to get to know this girl and me getting to know myself and getting to know my calling through my work with this young woman. And ended up starting Emerge Lanka, which, as you said, is an organization that supports survivors in healing and developing their self-sufficiency. But for me, that process actually also taught me a lot about myself, right? It taught me about my passion. It taught me about my leadership. It was a huge growing experience. And my whole trajectory really changed because of that moment and because I was willing to kind of chase that moment and that feeling that I had in that moment.
Wow, that is a powerful story. And I just want to acknowledge, I don't know if anybody's listening or watching, experiencing the same thing that I'm experiencing, but it's like a super somatic experience. Like my affective empathy, my mirror neurons are firing, trying to imagine that woman, that young girl's life and the moment
Yeah.
of your meeting, and all that that represented. It's just a really powerful story. And your life now is an expression of that moment. So thank you for sharing that. That does really add a whole other layer to your bio, and which is why I love asking this question. I wonder, because we're going to get into co-creation, and I know we have some really interesting questions to surface and grapple with. Could you just share a little bit more about what Emerge does? And I'll have information in the show links in case anybody wants to learn more and support the work that you're doing.
For sure, for sure. And I should say, on the note of the somatic reaction, I mean, I think it's so normal, and that was me, right? And, almost 20 years ago, like half a lifetime ago for me, and I still have that reaction. But for anybody who's listening today, I think some of the things we'll talk about may be challenging, and so take care of yourself. And if you need to pause this, it's okay, right? Like these can be really tough topics. So Emerge, what we do, we support teenage girls and gender nonconforming youth who have experienced extreme trauma, sexual abuse, exploitation, and have been removed from their homes for their protection and are testifying in court. Girls like that first girl, right, who are going through Sri Lanka's really challenging justice system and taking a stand to protect themselves, sometimes to protect siblings. And we make sure that they get the mental health support, the education support that they need during that time. And we also really support them as they're transitioning out of government care and out into the community. So our big focus is reintegration. What happens at age 18, unfortunately, is that these young people are no longer the responsibility of the state. And so when they turn 18, um, they've been in protection for all of their teenage years and have no sense of how to ride the bus or get a job or navigate the world or do their grocery shopping. And suddenly they're placed out on their own with no social support system, no family, no job readiness. And so we provide a transition program that's really experiential to help them um, learn to navigate the world in a way where they can fail forward in a safe place and ask questions and practice relationships and pick careers that they're interested in, and then become a part of our like lifelong sisterhood that's there to support them.
Because the reality for looking at the context is that they are often ostracized or completely
shunned by their families and they
Yeah.
might not go to formal education. They have no resources. So Emerge steps up and provides the
Yeah.
supports for them to have agency and flourish. Incredible, incredible, incredible work. Huh. So if I pivot, I want to share what the IDG framework defines as co-creation first and just have you comment. Does it resonate or what you might want to add? Okay.
Sure.
They define co-creation as skills and motivation to build, develop, and facilitate collaborative relationships with diverse stakeholders characterized by psychological safety and genuine co-creation. How does that sound to you?
Um, I like that. I think the psychological safety really resonates with me. There's a quote that I hold very sacred in my work, and I wish I knew who to attribute it to, but every time I look it up, there's a little bit of debate about who said it first. But the quote is, "Change happens at the speed of trust." And what I find in my work is that whether it's at an individual level, and today we're going to be talking about co-creation in more of a collaborative level, that both personal change and collective change can't happen until there's a fundamental level of psychological safety and trust between groups. And so, one part of my story that we didn't, well, you got to in the bio, but we didn't get to in my explanation of sort of the nuance was, after starting Emerge, I went on to found a second organization, and that organization really brought together um, young people and government and providers to reimagine systems that were leading to youth exploitation in San Francisco. And what we realized really quickly was if we wanted all of those groups who come from really different backgrounds and really different positions of power to be able to work together on solutions, we had to start with building trust and building understanding between them. And so, yeah, that definition does resonate with me. And I think the psychological safety in particular and the collaboration across diverse stakeholders feel like very important pieces.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm glad that there's sort of at a high level buy-in with the definition. I think you're such a perfect person to speak to this because if I think about the stakeholder groups that you work with, you've mentioned youth, you've mentioned your own team, you've mentioned the government, you've mentioned private sector donors. Like you've had to sort of co-create across all those landscapes. So let me start here. Your experience with co-creation has taken many different forms, but it has focused on engaging youth specifically who have
Yep.
experienced incredible trauma, have been systematically disenfranchised in the systems that are supposed to support them, right? So, one of
Yeah.
the things that I'm struck by is the distinction that you make between having a seat at the table versus co-creating or reimagining the table itself. So can you walk us through how you deconstruct traditional power dynamics? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was struck by when I came into this space was a lot of the language around let's get young people to have a seat at the table. Let's invite survivors to have a seat at the table. And I kept thinking like, what is this table we're all supposedly sitting around? And why is that the analogy? And it's like the boardroom. It's like this old uh, metaphor of how decisions are made, how power structures work. And it's inviting people who are typically, disenfranchised in to step into the norm, right? Rather than questioning, well, why is that the norm? And is that actually the space that we all want? Like maybe we don't want a table. Maybe we want something different. And so I was on a podcast maybe a year or so ago with somebody named Tanya Bhattacharya, who does a lot of communications work. And she talks about reimagining the table as a campfire and gathering around the campfire. And I thought this was such a beautiful analogy, and I will get to what this means practically in a second. But just if we think about our work rather than as the place where decisions have to be made and the board agenda has to be pushed forward, and how do we make sure that everybody has the skills to function in that space? If we instead imagine our work with the analogy of a campfire circle, it's really different. You're like eating together. You're all sitting on the ground. There's people of different ages coming together. We're telling stories. We're anchoring it in different kinds of wisdom. There's not really an agenda, right? So it's just a really different dynamic. And so I invite people to play with this metaphor because when you're thinking about co-creation, sometimes we're holding old paradigms in place and then letting people maybe tweak a little piece. And the question is like, is that the right paradigm to even be holding to begin with, right? Like, is there a way to completely change it? So what does that mean practically? Well, I've done a lot of work, like you said, with young people. And one example, I ran a project that was, I was chairing the youth trafficking committee for the mayor's task force on anti-human trafficking. And we had no youth on the youth trafficking committee. And so I wanted to figure out some way to engage youth on the youth trafficking committee, which started out as it seemed like a very simple project and turned into quite a complicated one. Um, but what we realized, we like secured some funding, we developed this fellowship, and we had all of this programming to develop youth leadership capacity and support their healing and development. One of the things that we realized really early on was that it wasn't just the youth who needed to develop skills, but actually the adults in the task force also needed to develop some skills to be able to create space for young people. And that the traditional way these meetings were happening wasn't a way that actually was welcoming to people from different backgrounds. It was held in City Hall. We had to go through metal detectors. There was law enforcement with guns. We were at these really big tables that were really formal with old school rules. And so we needed to look at um, where we convened, breaking into small breakout groups, eating together, um, building relationships outside of those meetings before we came into the meetings, um, and also doing coaching and training with the service providers and the government agencies who were part of the task force in advance to start to shift this paradigm of um, adults and practitioners as the people with wisdom, inviting others in to like interview or to um, kind of inform, to instead a paradigm that's more like we're all learners and we're all working together. And that sounds kind of easy in practice, but it's really challenging. And I think it's existentially really hard when, and I've been there, like I've been a service provider and say you've been um, providing services your whole life or working in the foster care system your whole life. And suddenly you're confronted by somebody who's taking part in those services who feels like they've actually really been hurt by your life's work to do good, right? Like, how does that feel and how does that resonate when like your intention is actually maybe causing harm? I mean, it's really challenging. So, like, how do we actually build scaffolding and prepare people to do that inner work so that in those moments we're not creating anger, but we're actually having healthy dialogue?
And one that is safe with lots of trust. I'm so
Yeah.
taken by what you're describing because it echoes some other conversations that I've had on the podcast within the IDG framework. One woman who was expressing how across the world, different cultures have different um, like there's a temporal element to how they speak. And, in North America, as soon as somebody's finished speaking, we're ready to like jump right in if we're not actually already talking over their last few words, guilty of it too. Whereas in some cultures, there's expansive moments between voices just so that we can integrate what has just been said and we don't rush to speak again. That I found fascinating. Then just the whole idea of, you know, centering presence and letting something unfold. Like there's this sort of like white supremacy nature to meetings with an agenda and
Yep.
time codes to how much time we're going to spend. But sometimes things need to be more porous. Sometimes we need to
Yep.
go where the energy goes.
Yep.
We don't get to six things but
Yep.
so much more is accomplished to co-create the
Yep.
space where trust emerges. So I wonder, okay, you've put this frame out there. How do you personally, as a leader and as an action-oriented doer, what have you learned to do to lift space or hold space for, other disenfranchised voices to be heard so that the power asymmetry is corrected a little?
I mean, it's such a good question. And let me tell you, I get it wrong all the time. Like I am constantly learning and I'm constantly messing up. And there's so many ways in which, intellectually we might understand something. Like I understand everything you're saying. And then I still have my own cultural biases. I still like to get things done really quickly. I still by nature am the problem solver who liked math and wants to find a solution and wants to keep moving. Um, and so, and yet I've worked across a lot of different cultures, and there are really different norms around language, around body language, around ritual, around eating. So continuously learning. What I would say for me, the most important thing I've done is make sure that I am not facilitating those spaces alone. So I know that's a vague answer, but like recognizing that for those of you who cannot see me but hear me, I am a white American woman that comes with certain views, as we all do. Um, and when I'm in space and I'm trying to convene different kinds of actors, it's been really important to find co-facilitators who have really different lived experience from me, like wildly different facilitation skills, different background, different lived experience, maybe different gender identity. Um, and I will tell you, I worked with one person where at the beginning we really struggled to work together, and we had to do a lot of work outside of the space to actually build trust between us because we're like, this is not going to show up well in trust building with the space if we don't fundamentally trust each other. So like what do we need to do to get on the same page? And that person and I became incredibly close, but um it took a lot of work outside of the space. And a lot of that work happened over meals. Food has been really important. It's something that brings lots of people together.
I love it. And I just think, you're talking about this very specific relationship, but I just think if we were to take it 64,000 feet up, the private sector just functions at this sort of like rational efficiency model orientation. And if those players want to do good work with other actors in the space of agency, equity, justice, that there needs to be a it needs to be salient to them that they occupy power and that it shouldn't be driven by their norms of operating, that there should be an invitation for other ways of working. I love that we've started with this. Okay, so
Hang on, can I add one more thing?
yes.
Sometimes you can leverage if you are the white American person in power like I am, sometimes there's an opportunity to leverage your positional power to create space for other folks. So for example, very practically, again, going back to that task force, I was elected to chair that committee. I had no idea what I was doing. But then I wanted to get youth involved. And I realized I wasn't going to be the right person to hold all of that. And so I decided as chair to appoint a co-chair. And that co-chair was really different than me and was somebody who I wanted to be able to support with young people. And because we had positional power in that space, we were able to make sure young people were heard when they were coming in, right? We were able to leverage that to like change the dynamics of the room, change the setup of the room, make sure that like the game shifted. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I would challenge like companies and people who are taking up space to like think about like how do you use your space to think about what can you do differently and like what table are you building, right? Or what campfire are you building? Um, because you hold a lot of tools and that doesn't mean you necessarily have to be in the limelight all the time.
And the quote that's coming up that I don't know who to attribute to, and I'm going to botch it up, is like, You want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, you
Yep.
go together, right? That's what
Yeah.
you're, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the mantra here. Okay. So in your experience, what structural changes have been most crucial in shifting from tokenism inclusion to genuine partnership with young people?
Yeah. So this is something like so many young people that I've worked with have complained about. They're like, oh, I've been a part of so many committees or people have invited me to speak at their gala and I help them raise all this money and then I never hear from them again. People just want my sob story and I'm bigger than that. And so this is something I've grappled with a lot. We each hold different kinds of knowledge and wisdom. And I think for a very long time, we've prioritized academic credentials. And in co-creation, there's a lot of different kinds of wisdom that you want to bring to the table. And there's a lot of wisdom that I don't have. There's certain lived experiences that I don't have. And that is valuable. Just like understanding, having a PhD in a certain area is valuable. They're both really valuable. And so, in the same way that we compensate for certain educational skills, like my belief is we should also compensate for participating and offering wisdom and knowledge and consultation in a co-creation process. Doesn't mean you need to overcompensate. There's a risk of it becoming a little transactional, but to really think about when you're bringing people together, if you're applying for a grant, if you're looking to develop a process where you're convening stakeholders, how do you honor their time and how do you honor what they've been through to bring that intelligence to your work? So compensation's a big thing, even for young people. Titles are a really big thing. Um, Thinking about, especially with young people, they're building a resume. They might be putting stuff on LinkedIn. Again, not overinflating that title, but what is accurate with what they were able to contribute to the project that really speaks not for the worst moments of their life or a description of their lived experience, but for their actual contribution to what they did. Um, in my work, because I've worked with a number of young women who've been trafficked or been in the underground street economy. A number of them are single moms. And one of the very practical things we needed to do to make sure they were able to participate in co-creation processes was offer childcare support because they weren't going to be able to come if they couldn't either bring their kid to the meeting or have someone there to watch their kid. Um, Transportation vouchers. Um, and then I think for us, like the two biggest things were really like both making sure that young people felt prepared to show up in a meaningful way. So, like, what are the skills and scaffolding that they need to participate? And that looked like, um, there was one project I did where we were developing a youth drop-in center. And young people were designing everything. They were like picking the providers, they were designing the logo, they were surveying other youth. But that meant they needed to develop survey skills. They needed to learn how to write emails to providers. They needed to learn how to project plan. So helping them develop those muscles so that they could be effective in those roles was really important. And then at the same time, like we were talking about earlier, how do we make sure the other stakeholders involved also have the skills to receive stakeholders that they might not be used to interacting with. Um, and the last thing I'll say that I wish I had known up front, and maybe I'm sure other people do this much better than me, but kind of like my biggest lesson learned in all of this is to be really clear, especially when you're working with young people or folks who um, have really been disenfranchised, to be really clear up front about any constraints or any power dynamics that you know exist and to just acknowledge them. So, what I mean by that is like if there's a limitation to where the play space is or where the co-creation space is, and if you know you can't go beyond that limitation, be upfront about it so that people don't feel um, tricked. Like they get somewhere and then suddenly you don't want their input. And I'll give a concrete example of how this manifested in my work. That the drop-in center that I mentioned, we brought on a group of youth founders. They went through a multi-month process. They were compensated. We secured a building, and everything was going really well. But the building was zoned in such a way that the front portion of the building had to be an art gallery, according to the city. It's just the public zoning requirements. A certain percentage of the building had to be a public art gallery. And so to meet these requirements on the side, I was having conversations with artists to figure out how to make the most of this space. But I neglected to share that up front with this group of young people. And they like imagined this wonderful idea for this whole space. And then I had to kind of backtrack and explain that actually the rest of the building was available, but this front piece, we had these constraints around. Um, but for a little while, I think that actually severed our trust because there was a question of like, is she just trying to control our vision? Why weren't we included? Why didn't we know about this up front? And so because that trust is so sacred and because power dynamics have been so historically imbalanced, really thinking through and being upfront about like the boundaries, the constraints, the power dynamics, the places you know it might be a little uncomfortable so that you don't hit them later on and then have to kind of like repair is important. And, you know, it won't be perfect, but it's something that I now think about in advance of the process.
Yeah, I think that's what is really surfacing in this conversation so far is that co-creation, as much as you might have great intentions of bringing a group of people together and just like, let's all co-create together with the best of intentions, that I think that there's this need to acknowledge power lives in all spaces and to
Yep.
uplift folks who typically get marginalized or disenfranchised and to meet them where they're at and really hear, like really give them um, time, attention, information. So thank you. Thank you for that. That's really helpful. That's very concrete. You also mentioned that adults need to be ready not just to listen, but to hear and adjust. Same idea. A little one. Can you share a time when a young person challenged any deeply held assumptions that you had and how that transformed your approach to co-creation?
Yeah. So I will say, out of all of the work I've ever done, uh, and I think my most meaningful, but also my most challenging work has been co-creation with young people. Like should be the framing of this entire podcast because it's so challenging. I mean, it's like young people, one, read you really, really well, and they call BS on you. You know, I work with teenagers, and they're very quick to be like, you don't believe that, right? Or like, "Uh, screw you, right? Um, and I think for those of us who have this deep need and goal and vision of like trying to do good in the world, it's like deeply emotional to be confronted with the idea that maybe you're causing harm, right? And I think it's really important, but it's challenging work. It's important work, but it's challenging work. And so I'm glad you're asking this question because, yeah, young people call me out all the time. And I'm going to give you an example, but like it's not easy. It's not fun. It's painful. You look like you had something to say.
No, I'm just listening. I'm all ears.
Okay. So, yes, all the time I feel like I'm questioned and my thinking evolves and you know, half the time I'm like maybe I should get out of this space and the corporate world is just so much more black and white and would be so much easier. But I also am really grateful for that evolution. So one story that comes to mind for me that really shifted my thinking was early in my time in California. I going back to the um, task force that I was running that I told you about. We were putting together the youth fellowship and engaging young people in the task force. And this was my very first cohort of young people. And we were playing with a bunch of different modalities to get input. So we were, you know, exploring with art and poetry and all different modalities. And we did a poetry workshop. And this young person um, had a poem that has stuck with me to today mean, this has been, I don't know, maybe 7 years. And I don't remember the exact words of the poem, but I remember the essence of it, and I remember the impact on me. So her poem basically said something like, "Who says pimping started on the streets? It started by the time I was 13, I had been in 10 homes. It started when the state put a price tag on my head and when I found out what I was worth." And she goes on to um, talk about how when she was 13, she ran away because she decided she didn't want her foster parents to get paid to hurt her anymore. And while she was on the street, she met a man who helped her find freedom and agency by selling her body. And it was the first time she actually felt like she had power and control over her life and she could take care of herself. And people couldn't hurt her because she had her own money. And so she gave him some money to thank him. He didn't ask for money. She gave him some money to thank him. And so in this story, if we zoom back to the way that like we're educated about trafficking and the way the government looks at trafficking, the man who quote unquote showed her how, introduced her to the sex trade, who she gave money, would be a trafficker. And in her eyes, this is somebody who helped her get out of an abusive situation. And her understanding of her being worth a finite amount of money started when she was a really little kid. And it started with the state system that was meant to protect her, but never listened to her when her social worker came and she said she was being hurt. And I found it really powerful. Um, I had known that there was nuance, and I knew the story was bigger than victims and villains and good guys and bad guys, but there was something about hearing it through poetry that like, I mean, earlier we were also talking about that like somatic impact, right? Suddenly I'm like hearing from this young woman who like I had watched our relationship evolve and like her passion in her poetry and in her delivery about how she felt so exploited by the people who were supposed to care for her and how she had found agency and freedom. And it really transformed the way I saw issues. And it really made me committed to helping young people find their own sense of freedom and their own sense of agency on their terms, which isn't always what other adults might want for them, right? But it's like, what does that mean for you? How do I help you get closer to what feels safe and what feels good for you? Um, so yeah, I mean, she changed my thinking in a very profound way.
I mean, that was another breathtaking story. And I think for me, when I think about the IDG framework across these five domains, co-creation is in the collaboration frame, but it requires what I'm hearing you say, what's coming up for me are things like humility, things like empathy and compassion. Like there's so much that one skill requires other skills along the
Yeah.
other domains. Wow, that was a very, again, I'm sure people who are listening to this conversation are having their own powerful aha moments. I'm sure. So thank you again. I have three questions to go. Um,
Okay.
how does the language we choose impact people's ability to define their own narratives and bring their full selves to co-creation spaces?
Yeah. Oh, language is so powerful. And, I'm not a words person. I still identify as like the engineer and the math person, not the words person. But I am a bigger and bigger believer that words shape who we are today and who we are tomorrow. And then we need to be really mindful of the words we use. And a couple ways in which my thinking has evolved in working with young people that I'll share. One is using person first language, identifying like when I'm thinking about challenges, these are things that happen to people that don't, not that define people. So maybe it's somebody who experienced homelessness or experienced trauma or has been trafficked or was in the sex trade or has been through cancer. But that's not their full identity, right? Like all of us have been through things, myself included, and I don't want to be public about all of them, right? That's not what I want to cast the world. Whether you've been through a divorce or a death in your family or cancer or trauma or abuse or rape. I mean, so everybody has been through something, right? And we're all also, that shapes us, that impacts us, but we're also so much bigger than our darkest moments. And I've met a lot of young people and also young adults who shared really intimate parts of their story publicly um, at one point in their life and then regretted it later on and felt like they had been kind of coerced to share. And then it's out on the internet and it's like you never can take it back. And so, I am all for people owning their story and owning their power and like whatever people want to share is wonderful. And when I've hired people or when I work with young people and they start their bios with what they've been through, I want to make sure that that's what they really want to put out and know that that's not the only reason. That's not the only value they have, right? Like we all have more value than our hardest experiences. Um, and so that translates into titles as well. Like when we were starting our work for the task force, we initially wanted to form a quote unquote survivor advisory board. And then what we realized was a lot of the young people we were working with didn't identify as being a survivor, right? Like some felt like they had been in the underground street economy. Some didn't like the term survivor. Many of them didn't want to be identified with that, didn't want to use that on like LinkedIn. Um, we had one person who hadn't been directly impacted, but their sister had been impacted and they still had wisdom to share. And so we ended up calling it a youth advisory board. We wanted it to be broader, right? Something that like they could be proud of, and it wouldn't be a label that in certain spaces could be stigmatizing, or in the future, if they didn't want to hold on to that part of their identity, that they had to. Um, and so when in doubt now, I actually I talk to the people I'm working with. I'm like, what kind of name would you like to have? And let them identify the language that's not only going to be present today, but it's going to impact their tomorrow.
And I think what you've shared has made me think again from like a slightly larger frame. It's not just people's lived experiences that show up in a space, but some people's identity markers, like this color of your skin or the cultural community that you come from, and that there's a whole whack of assumptions that come with you, good or bad, that you are holding in a space, right? And I
Yep.
think it also means that as we co-create, that we are conscious of the many subtle implicit biases that we hold about one another, and that also shows up in how we have dialogue, so that nobody feels like they are representing a group of people and they're the spokesman thereof and they're doing the heavy emotional lift of speaking on behalf of others. Like, I think it's very important.
Absolutely. It's so important. It's so important. And I think acknowledging that, I'm so glad you said that because I can't represent all white people or all women. Like, no, right? We have to set some of those ground rules up front. And we all make so many assumptions about each other. People make so many assumptions about me. And so I think also getting in touch as we think about like our inner work and the inner skills that we're developing, like think about the different identities you hold and also what are the assumptions people make about you. And some of those may be things you don't like, some may be things that you do like. And then you can think about either what do you need to complement that in these spaces to kind of round it out, or are there certain parts of your experiences or your stories that you want to share to build trust? But I think really being aware of identity is critical when you're thinking about bringing stakeholders of different backgrounds together.
And okay, so as a final thought on this, you've already elicited a bunch of them. You've talked about food. I wonder if there's any other thought that comes to mind that you want to share that helps to create the conditions for psychological safety when you're co-creating across like a broad, diverse group of people. Any last thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, so many things, and it really depends on the group, right? It depends on the culture, depends on the group. For the groups that I've worked with, one, really starting with community building. So not jumping right into the agenda, not getting to the work. The first work is building trust, building community, getting to know each other. And you can do that through food, art, dance, like whatever is relevant to the group that you're working with. The other thing that's been really important in the work I've done is actually setting up support systems for mental health. So making sure there's a therapist available and also other kinds of healing modalities because this kind of work, especially when it's challenging identity and when it's reforming systems that maybe have harmed different people, brings up a lot of emotion, a lot. And so what's the infrastructure and the scaffolding that we're going to provide to make sure that everybody is cared for? Um, and so that's something really practically that has been important. And what that looks like will depend on the community. I mean, I think there's a number of different, what we do in Sri Lanka is really different than what we did in San Francisco, for example, different indigenous practices, um, making sure that we're creating space that feels resonant and supportive. Um, Food, and then I think Um, again, just going back to like the what we've said about identity, thinking about who should hold power in the space, I think is the last thing I would leave you with is like being really intentional about who should hold the power in the space and whether there's a way to have a diversity of people who are holding power in the space.
Alia, it's been such a great conversation. I'm going to end with my last question that I ask all my guests on my podcast. But I said before we jumped on the call that I would address one thing, and I have to get it in, and that is that your ceiling looks like it's moving. So I just want, for those who have been watching and wondering what's up there going on in the corner, it's ladybugs, you told me, right?
Yeah, yep. Yeah, I hope I haven't grossed anybody out with these like little bugs on my ceiling. I'm in a farmhouse for everybody who's like watching or listening. I'm in a farmhouse in North Carolina. It's brutally cold, but this sunroom, for whatever reason, is like really warm and toasty, and it attracts in the winter all these little ladybugs up on the ceiling. It's like where they escape the cold.
Love it, love it, love it. So, can you think of a time in your life, whatever comes to mind, when you were on the receiving end of empathy? This is, after all, a podcast about empathy, and what that moment meant for you.
Yeah. I'm lucky, I think, to be a part of work where I'm surrounded by people who practice empathy and love and showing up to witness each other. And one of my deepest beliefs is that as human beings, we all have a deep need to just be seen. But I knew this question was coming because it's always on your podcast, and I did some thinking about it, and the first story that came to mind just kept coming back up. So I decided to use that one. It has nothing to do with my work. It's back from school, and it was back in high school, 12th grade. I went to a science and math school, go figure, going back to my story. And it was a boarding school. It was a public residential high school funded by the state. And I was really busy doing some science research and working to publish a paper. And I had this amazing science teacher and mentor who's guiding me through everything. And we were entering as a team into some national science competitions where we could win money for college. It's a really big deal. So this big competition was coming up in, I don't know, 3 or 4 days. And I'm in an exam and I get a call. I get called out of my exam. And the person says, Alia, we just got a call. Your father is in the hospital and the doctors aren't sure if he's going to make it beyond 24 hours. You have to go home. And I don't remember what happened after that moment. The next moment I remember I was in front of my research mentor's office, and she had put a sign up on her classroom door that said class is canceled for the day. And she had keys in her hand. And she was like, come on, we're driving to Asheville, which is like a 5-hour drive to the hospital. And there was like a class. She's like, we're going. I don't remember anything about the drive. I just remember she drove me straight to the hospital, dropped me off, and then turned right around and drove back the 5 hours to get home to her kids. And there was no discussion about like what this meant for this competition. You know, I knew that she had valued me as a student. She'd been mentoring me. She'd been prepping. This competition was a big deal for her as well. But in this moment, for me, it was like I suddenly realized that I was intrinsically valuable. That, like as a human, I was worthy, right? Like that she saw me and she cared about me as a human. It didn't matter. The research didn't matter. Like at the end of the day, human to human, I just mattered. Um, there were no questions asked. And so yeah, for all the teachers out there and for like Dr. Sheck, if you're listening, you're wonderful. You can make a really big impact on people long term.
Dr. Sheck, is that it?
Dr. Sheck.
Oh, big props to her. What a powerful story. And those who know this podcast know what I'm going to say. I love these stories. They anchor me because they remind me that we can all be so powerful as empaths, like by extending that empathy, by acting with that bold empathy. I mean, look, it stayed with you. You kept coming back to it, thinking of stories, and it made a huge difference in how you view yourself and gave you like manifest change to be where you needed to be in that moment. So thank you for sharing that. And the invitation to anyone watching and listening is again, let's just turn up the volume of empathy in our lives because we can do wonders when we do.
Yeah. I
Thank you for
so
the work.
agree. Thank you for having me. Oh.
Thank you for the hour we spent together. Thanks for the work that you're doing. We're going to have information about how you can support Alia's work with Emerge. And thank you all for watching and listening. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
If you know someone who'd benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Post the link on your socials and hit the subscribe button now. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.